Juvenile Life Without Parole, also known as JLWOP. A waiver is when a judge decides to move a juvenile case to adult court. Adult court is where the juvenile has the possibility of receiving a life sentence. Life without parole is when an offender is sentenced to prison for their entire life without a parole hearing and therefore does not have a chance of being released. The juvenile justice system differs from the adult justice system in several ways. After arrest, the officer files a report that goes to the district attorney, also known as the DA. If the DA decides to proceed informally, the juvenile will most likely be placed into diversion programs. The purpose of a diversion program is to deter the juvenile from committing future crimes. If successfully completed, the charge is dismissed. If the DA decides to bring charges formally, a petition is filed and the case goes to court where a judge hears victim and witness testimony to make a decision. If found guilty, a juvenile is not convicted but adjudicated and are given a disposition rather than a sentence. A judge also has the ability to modify a juvenile's disposition at any time. The DA can also choose to waiver the case. As previously stated, the waiver moves the juvenile case to adult court, and the juvenile will receive a hearing and a sentence just like adult offenders. This can lead to the life without parole sentence for homicide offenses. Juveniles are then sent to adult prisons. The United States is one of few countries that still allows juvenile life without parole. There are currently 8 states that prohibit JLWOP. Those states are Alaska, Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, New Mexico, New York, and the District of Columbia. There are currently more than 2,000 offenders serving life without parole sentences that were committed under the age of 18. 26% of those offenses are serving for felony murder related to robbery or burglary. 59% of these offenders are serving as their first-time offense. On average, black juvenile offenders receive life without parole 10 times more than their white peers. The youngest a juvenile has been sentenced to life without parole is 13 years of age. 16% of life without parole juveniles are between the ages of 13 and 15. The remaining are 16 or 17. Looking at the chart, in most every state listed, there are more black offenders than white. In addition, the combination of colored youth are far greater than white youth offenders. 42.4% of murder in black youth cases result in juvenile life without parole. Incarcerating juveniles for life is more expensive than adults because they will likely serve longer sentences than their adult counterparts. 50 years in prison for a juvenile can cost the state $2.25 million, and even more if the sentence is longer. California alone spent between $66 and $83 million in 1 year on juvenile life sentences. This money comes from taxpayers in each state, which can add up and take away from other funding programs such as schools. The backgrounds of juveniles vary some, but the common factors are typically the offender growing up in poor, unsupportive families. Many offenders have hard family lives and turn to the streets for a support system. 32% of juvenile life without parole offenders grew up in some form of public housing. These offenders are frequently exposed to violence. Many of them are abuse victims and/or have witnessed a family member commit a murder or a violent crime or another violent crime. 79% of life without parole offenders witnessed violence in their homes on a regular basis. 80% of girls with life without parole experienced physical abuse, and 77% had a history of sexual abuse. A common factor amongst juvenile delinquents is their schooling at the time of the offense. 40% of juvenile life without parole offenders were enrolled in special education classes at the time of their offense. A little less than half were not attending any type of school, and 84% were either suspended or expelled at least once throughout their schooling experience. There are several Supreme Court cases that have addressed the issue of juvenile life without parole. In Roper v. Simmons in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles cannot receive the death penalty. In Graham v. Florida, 2010, the Supreme Court ruled life without parole for juveniles was banned for crimes other than homicide. After that, in 2012, Miller v. Alabama decided, and Jackson v. Hobbs were decided together. The decision was that mandatory life sentences were a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Montgomery v. Louisiana in 2016 is the most recent case, ruled that children are constitutionally different from adults in their level of culpability. Moreover, the severest punishment must be reserved for the rarest juvenile offenders, those whose crimes reflect permanent incorrigibility. Also, in 2012, the courts ruled that judges must consider the differing circumstances for each offender. These cases connect with one another in that each one led to the ruling of the other. As previously stated, the Supreme Court ruled life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional when given for any offense other than homicide. These offenses include felony murder. Felony murder is when a homicide has occurred and all those involved in the crime are responsible even if they did not personally commit the murder. This typically happens in cases of robbery and burglary. There are a few challenges in juvenile life without parole. Juveniles differ from adult offenders. Their brains are not fully developed and do not always have the capacity to understand their actions or the consequences that go with them. Their brains are still considered immature. There are debates as to whether juveniles with life sentences should be granted a hearing to see if their maturity level has increased. In addition, there are not always enough resources in prison for juveniles. Some juveniles need psychiatric help, and prisons may not be the best place to receive that. There have been several groups who oppose juvenile life without parole because they believe juveniles should not be punished and not given a chance to grow and learn from their mistakes. One theory that relates to juvenile life without parole offenders is trait theory. This theory argues that a combination of personal traits and environmental factors relate to juvenile delinquency. In addition, the cognitive theory gives a perspective on the perception of reality and understanding the world in which one lives. Relating to mental illness, the social learning theory is the ideal that one learns through watching the actions of another. Many kids who are exposed to violence and violent crimes commit violent crimes in the future. Long-term incarceration affects offenders differently, and it especially affects juveniles. 62% of juvenile life without parole offenders are not in programming. This is mostly due to lack of services available in state facilities. In addition, in some facilities, juveniles are denied programming because of their life sentence status. However, 2/3 of juveniles with life sentences have received a high school diploma or GED to receive some type of education, which they might not have received if not in prison due to dropping out, being expelled, etc. 24% of these juveniles are placed in prisons in the general population, and 32% have at least some contact with adult offenders. Having contact with adult offenders in prison can be harmful to the juveniles and put them at risk of abuse and expose them to further violence. In conclusion, juvenile offenders have very similar backgrounds of violent homes and poor education. Most of them have been abused by family and witnessed violent acts that can have negative effects on their mental and physical well-being. They received poor education in school or were in school at all. The Supreme Court continues to make rulings against juvenile life sentences with hopes of it being banned in the future.